Hi there, my name's Matt Easton and I run this little channel called Scholar Gladiatoria where I talk about history, warfare, weapons, this kind of stuff. If you're new to the channel, welcome. Please give me a subscribe. You'll notice there's a notification bell as well by the subscription. If you click that, then you'll get notifications of my new videos. Give this video a like and any of my videos if you do like them. Now, one of the questions that I often get asked when I show any form of pole weapon is about the durability of the wooden shafts. And I don't actually know where the concern specifically comes from, but it is actually a question I get asked quite a lot under my videos whenever I'm talking about things like this poleaxe, as this is called, or things like halberds or spears even. Or, you know, I've got a warhammer here, axes, things like this. So anything that has a wooden shaft. And I think it comes from the perception, perhaps, I don't know, from movies or something, perhaps even video games. It comes from the idea that perhaps something made entirely of metal or mostly of metal, such as a sword, like this long sword here, is somehow indestructible. And the first thing we have to say is, when answering the question, can these break and be chopped up and broken in use against things like swords, is that, well, any weapon can break. And I think that's a bit of a shocking concept to some people, because we don't see it happen very much in the sort of media where we see swords being used in TV series or movies or things like this. But the fact is that swords in the modern world do break in use. So any of us who practice HEMA or even modern sport fencing or reenactment will know that, unfortunately, no matter how good a sword is, no matter how good quality it is, using modern steels and modern heat treatments and all of the modern technology available to us, even modern made replica swords do break in use. I've personally seen swords break many times in fencing, both breaking on other people's swords and breaking on people. We know from historical accounts that happened as well, and I'll talk about the historical aspect in a minute. I've also, I've seen swords break in all sorts of circumstances. I've seen them break in cutting through various cutting targets like tatami mats and stuff. So you do, if a cut is formed wrongly or just bad luck, it encounters a hard object or twists in a certain way or vibrates in a certain way, unfortunately swords do break. And while I'm talking here, hopefully you'll be seeing some pictures of examples of broken weapons actually shown in period historical artwork. So medieval people fully accepted that this was a reality. Now, talking a little bit more about that, I mentioned that the modern swords made of modern materials do break, okay? And now what you have to recognize is that medieval steel, despite whatever sort of mythology or urban myths you may have been told, they didn't have secret arcane knowledge that gave them better steel than we have now. The fact is that modern steel is more homogeneous and of better quality than historical steel. Things do get better. Not always, not everything is always about advancement and evolution, but in the area of material science and how we understand how steel is produced and the different types of alloys of steel we can make and the heat treatment and the preciseness and the repeatability of manufacture, we are far ahead of what they were in the medieval period. That's not to say that their swords were all rubbish, not at all. The best quality swords, which generally speaking would be tested, so that's how you measure, did my heat treatment work? Is this steel good? Will this hold a good edge? Well, you test it. And quite simply, even up until the 19th, even until the 20th century with officers' swords, swords have always been tested, at least good quality ones were, and that's how you knew they were good quality. So yes, indeed, they did have access to good quality blades in the medieval period and the Renaissance. But the average quality of steel simply wasn't as good, because for the most part, with Wootz steel aside, they weren't using what we would call cast or crucible steel. That is, the steel has not been taken to melting point, the impurities you don't want removed, and then the correct amount of carbon put in to produce the steel that you want, or even other alloys such as vanadium or whatever. So they were working with steels for the most part, which are not as homogeneous and not as good quality as the ones we have today. So clearly, historically, swords were more likely to break than they are now. And even now, using modern steels and modern heat treatment, swords break. Okay, so that's the first thing to say. And it is an important, I understand I've spent a few minutes saying it, but that is a really important part of answering the question of, do wooden hafted weapons, are they perishable in combat? The fact is that all weapons are perishable in combat, even modern made swords, very good, even top quality modern made swords. And certainly historical swords, as we know from the written accounts and the artistic accounts, that swords did break. So, coming back to the original or origin question, did wooden hafted weapons, were they perishable in combat, especially when being used against things like swords or hitting people in armour and this kind of stuff? Well, the simple answer is yes, in the same way that swords are, but is a wooden shaft like on this poleaxe, which I suspect is ash, and that would have been a traditional wood to use for this sort of polearm, whether it be a spear or a bill or a glaive or a poleaxe or halberd or whatever. Ash was a very popular wood. And does ash break in use? Well, yeah, it can do. And obviously, if it's being chopped up by other things, other axes or swords or whatever, if it's getting indentations and notches into the wood, that is a focal point for stress, and it opens up the grain and means that yes, it is more likely to break at that point. But these are stout, strong bits of wood, and you can use a wooden shaft like this, as you know, for felling trees with a tree felling axe or something like that for years and years and years, and it will never break. And even if it's getting damaged, if it's getting indentations and this kind of thing in its surface, it will still be strong. And obviously, the longer the shaft gets in the proportion to its width, the weaker it's going to be. So if we're dealing with something like a light spear, for example, or a pike, something which is very long in proportion to its width, of course you are increasing its likelihood of it breaking. Something that's relatively thick and stout, like a poleaxe, like this one, this is got a pretty fat shaft, and I can only just get my, I've got fairly large hands, I can only just get my fist around this shaft, and it's pretty stout, and the likelihood of this breaking from impacts from other weapons, well, from swords, I think it's going to be minimal. When we're dealing with a short weapon like the warhammer, known colloquially as the wall hammer around here, that's far, far less likely to break because obviously it's very wide or thick in comparison to its length. Something long, as I've said, like a spear or a pike, more likely due to flexing and tension. Something like this, relatively unlikely. But one thing that I have to highlight is that if a shaft breaks, in my experience, it is more likely to break as a result of hitting something than of something hitting it a lot of the time. So one of the reasons, you'll notice this poleaxe has what are called languets, okay, so these steel or iron braces essentially up the shaft. As I spoke about in my previous poleaxe video, the video that came before this one, check that out if you haven't seen it already. One of the reasons for those being here is to stop, if a break happens down in the wood here, it keeps everything together. So even if the wooden shaft breaks inside these languets, the head's not going to go flying off. So literally this wooden shaft could crack and break inside here. And people always think, oh, these are to protect from cuts and blows from other weapons. Well, partially, yes, that's true. But also partially, it's just to keep the head on the shaft. And even if that shaft breaks in here, and I've seen this happen with a pole weapon, the head won't fly off because it's connected at multiple points. And if the break happens inside here, and if this type of shaft does break from a heavy impact on something, it's usually going to break around this area here. If that does happen, the weapon will still hold together in such a way that you can still use the thing as an effective weapon in combat. Anyway, the head's not going to fly off. You will obviously want to get that wooden shaft replaced at a later point when you're no longer fighting for your life. But in that combat, that weapon should stay together. Okay? So, to sum up, yes, absolutely, wooden shafts on weapons can break. But swords can break as well, and often did. Okay? If a wooden shaft does break, then it can be held together by the languets, and that's one of the reasons that they're there, partly to reduce the chances of it breaking. and also to reduce the effects, the negative effects. If it does break, it will still keep everything together to some extent. But also, wooden shafts are really, really strong and stout in most cases. And something that's longer and by necessity narrower, because it has to be lighter and more nimble like a spear, because it's so long, you couldn't make it very fat because then it would be too slow and too heavy. Those do have some larger degree, a larger likelihood of breaking. And I should mention at that point, lances. So some of you will know that lances, certain types of lance for jousting mainly, but they were sometimes used in warfare as well, were literally designed to break. Okay, the reason being that if you've got the thing couched under your arm with a lance rest or a rester there supporting it and stopping the weapon sliding back when you make impact with the opponent, when your point or coronel hits the opponent, what you don't want to do is find that you're colliding and being driven off the back of your own horse or making your horse stop or jolting yourself. You want as much force to go into the target as possible and then to break the shaft off so that you can carry on going. So you do have deliberately destructible wooden shafts on things, but those lances are quite a special case. And even though they do break, they're a kind of one-use weapon, I suppose, in that sense. Even though they do break, they are designed to break for that purpose. It is part of their goal, and also it still transfers a huge amount of energy to the target. But as ever, things like spears, you know, that is one of the reasons that if they do break in combat, that is one of the reasons that spearmen throughout history have often had some form of secondary weapon, some sort of backup weapon, such as a sword. If we go back to the ancient world, if we're talking about triarii in Rome, or we're talking about Greek hoplites, or we're talking about Anglo-Saxon and Viking warriors with spear and shield as their primary weapons, they would almost always have a sword or a large knife or an axe or something as a backup weapon. So there we go. Wooden shafted weapons, yes, they can break, so can all weapons, including swords. But generally speaking, something certainly like a poleaxe or a warhammer or a one-handed axe or a Dane axe is unlikely in most scenarios to break. And if they do break, it's often simply from hitting someone really, really hard and it breaks the shaft, rather than being chopped through with a sword, which is not a very likely thing to happen in normal circumstances. Anyway, cheers for watching. Give us a subscribe if you haven't done. Click that notification bell, because I know not that many of you have, because I can see on my analytics report. And give us a like. Come back and watch my next video. I've got extra videos on Patreon, and I'll be here making more videos about things like this really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.